And now it's Boomer Life. Lifestyle ideas designed to make your life more engaging, meaningful, and complete. Celebrating the baby boomer generation, this is Boomer Life with Sterling Fox.
Well, hello. Welcome to Boomer Life here on AM 650. On the program today, we're going to talk about solutions to debt problems. The discussion will give you every reason to believe there is hope and that there is freedom after debt. It may not feel like it at the moment, but in fact there is. And if you're feeling like you're in an island of financial trouble, or if you have excessive debt, you don't have to feel overwhelmed and isolated. There are solutions. And joining us in studio today to talk about them is George Abakhan. Mr. Abakhan is president of Abakhan and Associates here in Vancouver. George, welcome. Good to see you.
Nice to be with you.
It's a pleasure to have you on Boomer Live. Let me just tell our listeners a little bit about you, and then I'll do the written stuff, and then you can tell us the colorful stuff. After 20 years with Deloitte & Touche and its predecessors in the Financial and Special Services Group, and as the director in charge of British Columbia, George Abakhan retired in 1998 to open his own consulting company, Abakhan and Associates, Incorporated. As president of this new company, it's a debt settlement administrator and bankruptcy trustee organization. Mr. Abakhan is a chartered accountant. He is a licensed trustee in bankruptcy. He is a retired former fraud examiner, and he has over 30 years of business experience, including 12 years of industry experience in senior management positions with companies like Rivtow Straits and Laurentide Financial Group and our own ICBC here in British Columbia. And in addition to practicing in all matters pertaining to bankruptcy and insolvency, George Abakhan continues to deal with individuals trying to find their way out of their own personal debt crisis. And George Abakhan and Associates also continue to deal with complex corporate insolvency issues, including due diligence reviews, mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures, and other corporate finance engagements. Mr. Abakhan, you're one busy fella. How many people in Abakhan and Associates? You have 5 offices around British Columbia, George. How many people on your team?
We have today 28 people, and I think we'll probably be looking for a couple more soon.
Okay. Is the wave of insolvency that we seem to be experiencing here in British Columbia any different from anywhere else in Canada, or is all of the country sort of awash in cheap money and problems resulting from it?
I think it's pretty well awash throughout the country. There's probably about 120,000 insolvencies every year in Canada. BC has approximately 11,500. We're much smaller than the United States. The United States has 1.6 million insolvencies every year.
Oh, boy.
And they don't have the advantages of what we have, the debt settlement process that is available under the Bankruptcy Act.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by an insolvency? And I know I'm sort of stopping on early jargony things, but it's again, this is an area in which people get into some big problems, and so I'm just trying to make sure that as we work our way through the conversation, what exactly do you mean by insolvency? Does that mean bankrupt automatically, George?
No, not at all. You can be insolvent if you can't make your payments as they come due. So if you have a contract that says you're going to, an agreement with, say, a creditor that you're going to pay his debt in 30 days,
right,
and you can't pay it in 30 days, then you're not meeting your debts as they come due. If your credit cards say that you should be paying all the interest plus a bit of principal, and you're not making that payment, then you're not making the payments as they come due. The other test for insolvency is if you don't have enough assets to cover your debt. And invariably these days, people don't have enough assets to cover their debt,
right,
or equity in the house, a lot of people have been using their houses as ATMs.
Yes.
And the debt just keeps piling up. I'm sure people have read in the papers that our average debt to take-home pay is something like 163%
yes,
of the take-home pay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the average without mortgages in BC is $39,000. That's the average debt, and if you can imagine, that's somewhere between 19 and 24% interest that's compounding on that debt every day.
Right. And is the debt typically in the form of credit card debt, George? Is that the most likely form?
That's very much the most likely form.
And that's thus the high interest then, right?
That's the high interest
Right.
rate, and lines of credit generally. Yeah, the major banks and other financial institutions that offer the credit cards, that's where it's at.
Interesting. I got to ask you a personal question here, though, because I'm going through this very brief resume and not at all complete. But nonetheless, you were a senior manager with big companies like Rivto Straits and Laurentide Financial and ICBC. You were a mover and a shaker. Why on earth did you walk away from that corporate life of excess and wonderfulness to become an insolvency trustee, a debt administrator, George? That's quite a dramatic turnaround in career choices.
Well, it kind of crept up on me. As I say, I was senior director with director of operations with ICBC.
Mm-hmm.
But in ICBC, I ended up pulling together. I was in the early stages. I was the 50th guy on at ICBC, and when was it? 1972, 73. And they threw over all the stuff that they didn't want to deal with, like the general insurance, etc. So I ended up having to correct all that and integrate it into the operations. And I found I was doing the same thing with Rivto. At Rivto, I was buying companies like crazy with Lucille Johnston. She was my mentor and guide. And the thing grew from about 36 million to 220 million in 4 years.
Right.
In $1978. So it was that experience. And then at one point I'd been the CFO of the second largest trucking company in BC that went bankrupt. And I ended up making friends with the trustees that were looking after it.
Ah, okay.
So I continued on relationships, and they basically came after me and suggested I join them, which I did eventually. And it didn't actually change very much. I just seemed to be cleaning up other people's problems, which
right.
Mainly in the corporate side to begin with, but also personal problems. And then these days, of course, there isn't much corporate business going on, but there certainly is a lot of personal business.
Well, I was going to ask you that. The dynamic has certainly changed over the years,
Yeah.
and what percentage of the business would be corporate now versus personal in the provincial 5 offices combined?
In our situation,
Yeah.
it's largely personal bankruptcy, but we still get 25% of our business on a corporate basis.
Mm-hmm.
Mainly smaller companies. But there's been a big cleaning out of corporate insolvencies in the last 15 years, and now generally they should be pretty healthy.
Okay, I wanted to also find out one other thing, and that's I want to talk about credit counselors and bankruptcy trustees and the difference between the two. But in order to accomplish that, talk to us about the designation bankruptcy trustee or trustee in bankruptcy. It's a federal designation,
Yes.
and there are very few of you nationwide.
Actually, you got me there. I think there's about 89 in BC.
Exactly. That's not very many for a population of over 5 million people.
Well, BC, yeah. Does BC have 5 million?
Oh,
I guess
yes,
it does,
definitely, yeah.
And but we do have to partake in a pretty hard examination process.
Sure.
It's got, they do everything they can to make sure that the new trustees coming on board are technically able to run an office or close to being able to run an office. And even if you get your ticket, they still have a program of not giving you full license for another couple of years to make sure that you understand the process.
Sort of a probationary period there.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And maybe they limit you to personal bankruptcy files instead of commercial and the larger bankruptcy what we call ordinary bankruptcies.
Now, this of course, this is quite regulated. You're talking now in some detail about the way the government, in this case, the federal government,
Right.
regulates the insolvency business through the trustees.
Yeah.
You also mentioned a few moments ago that our next-door neighbors in America don't enjoy the same protections that Canadians do with respect to insolvency. Is this because in Canada our government is much more hands-on with the people who administer insolvency, like you?
Well, I can't speak totally for the United States system. I'm aware that insolvencies by way of debt settlement proposals have only recently come into the United States, and they've been in Canada for a while.
Okay, right.
And the bankruptcy process, I believe, in the United States is relatively simple. You can get some cards and you just deliver it to the court, or some paperwork, you deliver it to the court, and you're bankrupt.
Mm-hmm.
The big difference is in Canada, to my mind anyway, we can actually do deals with Revenue Canada, whereas in the United States you can't do any deals with
the IRS.
The IRS, and so people that have IRS debts, CRA debts,
Mm-hmm.
or Revenue Canada debt, we can many times make a deal with Revenue Canada, or the creditors can help in that regard. When we do a debt settlement process,
Right, because you're federally regulated
right.
trustees.
And the laws in Canada are such that Revenue Canada is a creditor,
Sure.
just like anybody else.
You bet, yeah.
That includes GST, source deductions as a priority, as a deemed trust situation. So that's a little more difficult to deal with, but it can be dealt with, either in corporations or on a personal basis. If you happen to be a sole proprietor, you could be liable for source deductions, and you then have a situation where source deductions, which is source deductions on payroll, have a trust obligation, because you've diverted the funds for your own use, which you shouldn't do.
Mm-hmm.
But that can be settled again under a debt settlement process.
Right, and this simply is not available to Americans and their tax department
That's right.
like it is to Canadians. Well, lucky us in that strange sort of way, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, I wanted to ask you, since we're sort of dealing with terms, and we'll talk about individuals and how people get into debt, and most importantly, how they can get the heck out of debt. But I wanted to just examine one other aspect of what's going on out there these days, George, that, I mean, there's so much of it. What is the difference, for example, between a bankruptcy trustee like yourself and a credit counselor?
Well, the biggest difference is that we can actually do a deal, and we can actually help people get rid of their total debt at a no-interest situation at so many cents on the dollar.
Okay.
I mean, there are certain situations where a person may have lots of equity in their house, and a credit counselor can help them get refinancing, and they can make the interest payments and the mortgage payments. They're not really the sort of people that would come to us. Generally, the people that come to us don't have any equity in the house. They're suffering from large credit card payments.
Right.
I mean, I had a situation the other day where guy was owed approximately $62,000. Revenue Canada was owing only $9,000, but had garnished his wages
Oh, boy.
for $1,200 a month.
Thereby further reducing his ability to service the rest of his debt.
Exactly.
Okay.
And his credit card debt was $1,200 a month. That he was making payments of $1,200 a month on his $62,000. Actually, it should have probably been more than that, but there's $2,400. He was only earning $3,900. That left him $1,500
A month to live on.
A month to pay for his car, his mortgage, his family of 4 food, and medicals, and etc. I ended up settling that, or at least advising him we could settle it at around $400 a month.
Right, right.
He kind of died and went to heaven, and asked for an application form immediately.
Right, of course. Now, was that in the form of a consumer proposal, or was that individual required to go bankrupt?
No, he came on saying he had to go bankrupt. I told him that I didn't think he had to go bankrupt, but asked him just to bear with me for a little bit and allow me to ask him some questions. The first question I asked him was, how much do you owe?
Yeah.
And then I said, how much do you earn? And I said, well, and then I immediately figured out on my iPad that it'd be about $400 a month. And that includes our fees.
Mm-hmm.
There's no interest on that outstanding. There's no interest accruing on it. It includes our fees, includes all the expenses, the superintendent of bankruptcy fees, and so on.
And some of these arrangements simply can't be produced by a credit counselor. They require the input and the presence of a trustee in bankruptcy, correct?
Exactly. For that sort of basis, generally the credit counselors, although they can get reductions in debt and reductions of interest, the mere act that they do that is an act of bankruptcy anyway, as far as the debtor is concerned. But no, and generally we get a lot of referrals from debt counselors.
Sure.
For that very reason, that the people aren't able to handle the debt counselor type payments.
Right. Well, I appreciate your taking the time to explain the difference between the two, because this is an area in which people get panicky, and then there's a lot of confusion to begin with, and then you throw a little panicky on top of that, and people get disoriented really quickly. And we've touched on another bit of defining I need you to do after we take our first break here, George, and that would be the difference between bankruptcy and a consumer proposal, a remedy that not a lot of consumers are even aware of, even though it's got their name on it.
Exactly.
Our guest is the president of Abakhan and Associates, trustees in bankruptcy. George Abakhan is with us on this episode of Boomer Life, and it's nice to have you with us as well. And we're back after this quick timeout.
Canada's only weekly radio show dedicated to the baby boomer lifestyle. This is Boomer Life on AM